Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, I don't know if you heard, but there's an election coming up. And Christians sometimes have very different views of what is relevant about Christian faith and how it informs our views about society and government. And so in a story like the one we just heard from Mark 10, which kind of speaks into this area a bit, talks about rulers and tyrants, we might be interested in reflecting on what, if anything, we might be able to apply to human governance and rule some 2,000 years later. And to the point of our series, can we drill down to get a clearer picture of the real Jesus and what that means for Christian faith? It would be wrong to assume that, the Bible gives us some grand blueprint for every policy in our times. History is, in fact, riddled with people trying to make the Bible support any number of bad and even malevolent policies like slavery. And that's worth a note since the word slave comes up in this particular reading, and I'll have a few words on that later. And although we should be careful about trying to overuse Scripture in supporting our favorite policies, there are some very strong themes that run through the Old Testament and New Testament. And these themes include caring for the neighbor and foreigner, seeking justice for those who are overlooked and poor, including orphans and widows. These are themes that are pretty hard to miss. In story after story, Jesus regularly cares for and elevates the dignity of people who are minimized and mistreated in his time, including children and women, foreigners, and those with physical and mental health conditions, among others. But beyond all of this, what comes across very strongly in the ministry of Jesus is opposition to the improper use of power. Nothing gets Jesus irritated more than the abuse of power that he sees. And so again and again, Jesus speaks to the basic values and character of what good leadership looks like. And I'll get to that in a moment, but first I want to just provide some context for today's story because it factors into struggles that his own disciples have in trying to grasp who Jesus really is and what he's teaching. Immediately before James and John ask if they can sit at the right and left hand of Jesus, we learn that Jesus and his disciples are on their way to Jerusalem, and this will become actually his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. That's where we are in Mark's gospel in this story. But just verses before Jesus announces, just before this story we have today, Jesus announces his coming fate for the third time. Going to Jerusalem isn't going to be the victory lap that they are expecting. Jesus has just told them, look, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again. And it's at this moment, immediately after Jesus says this, that James and John say to Jesus, appoint us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. It's like, what? Are you listening, James and John? Do you have any sense for what Jesus just got done saying? And those of you who've been following this series might remember week 3 when the disciples were all arguing with each other about who was the greatest. And at that time, Jesus kind of gently told them, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. The other 10 disciples are reportedly incensed by James and John now. It seems like James and John were busy talking in class and missed that lesson because they're still obsessed with being the greatest. And they even precede their request with a pretty brazen statement: "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." I don't know, do you ever go to a family member and say, "I want you to do for me whatever I ask of you"? What would their response be? I don't know. Try it sometime. Let me know how that goes. They want to sit at the right and left hand of Jesus. There is some symbolism related to what the right versus the left hand of a king or ruler means. They can represent different forms of power and duty, but the differences aren't particularly meaningful in this case. They both represent positions of power and influence. They want to sit in the presence of his glory. And what is this glory they imagine? Like I've talked about on many occasions previously, there was an idea that the Messiah would come and exert worldly power. And many in that era believed that when the Messiah came, he would kick out the Roman Empire. Like you would expect of any empire, Rome ruled with fear and violence. The common hope of freedom from all of this wasn't a bad thing. Rome absolutely oppressed the people of this and other lands, but what we find on many occasions up to the very end is that Jesus refuses to own this expectation of the Messiah. That's not the kind of Messiah that he is intending to be, one that simply begins a whole new cycle of rule that resorts to force and violence to install and maintain itself. And so Jesus responds to James and John, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" And they claim, "Oh yes, we are able." The image of a cup is significant in the Bible as a reference to a coming fate or judgment, and very often it can come with a sort of ominous quality to it. But there are instances when it's also a positive future and blessing. The reference to a cup will come up again when Jesus is praying in Gethsemane before his arrest and betrayal, when he says, "If it is possible, Father, pass this cup from me, and yet not my will, but your will be done." But the bottom line of this exchange between James and John and Jesus is that these disciples, as we sometimes see elsewhere in the Gospels, appear to be a bit clueless. And so Jesus gets more specific than he did back a chapter earlier. He says, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. Instead, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So the Gentiles' leaders are tyrants. The translation I read calls them great ones. In Greek, it's literally megaloi. We kind of understand that root word mega. It's the same root that gets used for words like megalomaniac. The megaloi are domineering over people, Jesus says. They exercise dominion. They tyrannize people. Is this really what you want? Jesus says that those who wish to be megas shall be your servant. I talked about that word for servant previously back in week 3 as well, and it's a word that gets used for ministry roles like deacons. But outside of the Bible, it was a term used for servants by ancient Greek writers to refer, as you might remember, to table waiters and at times the servants of kings. One of those ancient writers outside of the Bible who we know referenced these servants about 100 or 200 years before Jesus was Polybius. And just a refresher, Polybius is the one who wrote about the separation of powers in government, of checks and balances to limit power, and his introduction of the concept of the people, which influenced a variety of philosophers and authors over the centuries, including the framers of our very own Constitution. And I believe that a spirit of service and democratic ideals, and in fact Christian ideals, flow together. So Jesus is asking his disciples, do you want a megaloi, an authoritarian rule in which people are dominated and tyrannized, or do you want a society in which people serve one another and leaders also serve the people? Again, Jesus says, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first, the very greatest among you, must be slave of all. He's setting out just these total opposites and contrasts here. Slavery was a social reality in Jesus' time, as it has been in our own country's history and continues to be in some forms around the world. This isn't an affirmation of slavery by Jesus, but a way of saying that those who seek the very greatest power should first view themselves as the very lowest in status and power, as responsible for holding the care and well-being of everyone in their heart. So this is among the final lessons about power and authority that Jesus shares as James and John want seats at the table. But what does all of this mean for who Jesus really is and how Christians are supposed to lead and live today? The life of faith is about serving, and when we do have responsibility and positions of authority, we use it to serve with humility rather than revel in greatness. This is the character of those we should lift up, according to Jesus, those who can resist the very glory that would come with it to begin with. When we see a world around us that does not respect the justice, peace, or values we believe in, Jesus urges us not to use force or seek power to impose it. Instead, he calls us to love one another, even our enemies. It's only by living in grace, love, and peace that we can create a lasting society that is gracious, loving, and peaceful. But living in that way is not easy. It's the hard path, not the easy one. Doing so can require us to make sacrifices and take on the humility of a servant. And that's what Jesus did. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. But this kind of serving always has to be a choice of the individual. Jesus chose this path for himself. Some today look to faith more broadly as a source for moral and spiritual perfection and believe that Christians are called to enforce this moral and spiritual living, even upon others. The more harsh and demanding, the more faithful they perceive themselves to be. But this is exactly the kind of abuse that Jesus chastised in his own ministry and in his own time, in what he saw of the religious leadership of that day, most notably the Pharisees. They tried to enforce spiritual laws and yet neglected basic justice and love of neighbor. Tyrants, whether religious or secular in nature, place great burdens and demands on others, fostering fear and division for the sake of their own glory, to justify or enrich themselves. Servants take the burden upon themselves, bearing the cost to do what's right and to care for others, building the peaceful relationships in society that they seek. This was the true way of Jesus, who bore our burdens and freed us to live in loving relationship with God and one another. In your words and actions, may you live in the joy and peace of that way, in gracious community with all. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.